This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 814 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I'm going to do something a little bit different. If this show has helped you at all in the past, if you've gotten something from this show, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Those can go a long way to helping the show out. I'd really appreciate it. But this is a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. Buy CeeDee Lamb. Look, it's been a tough start to the season for CeeDee Lamb. Before Monday Night Football, he ranks as a low-end wide receiver 2 in PPR points per game. He's finished in the weekly top 20 at wide receiver just once this year. If you drafted Lamb early, you're not very happy. But Dallas has played in some really strange games. Week 1 was that blowout against the Giants. Lamb wasn't needed all that much. The Cowboys ran just 8 plays in a neutral game script. Now, week 2 wasn't as dramatic, but it was pretty similar. The Cowboys had a double-digit lead for a lot of that game, and even still, Lamb had a 35% target share and over 25 PPR points. Then in week 3, Dallas saw a negative game script and a weird one against Arizona. Lamb was a disappointment in that game. He only scored 10.2 PPR points. After that, it was that game against New England. The Cowboys destroyed them. That once again forced a run-heavy script. And then we saw what happened in week 5. San Francisco destroyed Dallas. The Cowboys couldn't get anything going offensively. We saw backups in the fourth quarter. None of the Cowboys' games have really been normal. I think we should expect that to change moving forward, at least to some degree. And that's good news for CeeDee Lamb. As is the fact that according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed methodology, over the next 4 weeks, no team has better wide receiver matchups than the Dallas Cowboys. And the Cowboys have the second best schedule from now through the end of the year. Up until this point, the schedule's been below average according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. So it's been tough. I totally understand. I have CeeDee Lamb myself. It has not been a good experience, but I do think that things are going to get better. Add Roschon Johnson and D'Onta Foreman. This is not the first time that I've talked about Roschon Johnson on this show. I've talked about him quite a bit. But this transaction needs to be repeated because Khalil Herbert has a high ankle sprain. He could miss basically the rest of October. And a lot of times with those high ankle sprains with running backs, when those backs come back, they're not as productive. So that's really bad news for Khalil Herbert, but it could be good news for Roschon Johnson. The thing is, Johnson himself was concussed on Thursday. Fortunately, he has more time to get healthy, but even still, he's at risk of missing week 6. If he's not able to go in week 6, because I think if he is active, he's going to get a lot of work. If he's unable to go in week 6, we're going to see a lot of D'Onta Foreman. Foreman hasn't been dressing for the Bears because he doesn't play special teams. That's been Travis Homer. But in this case, if Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson are out, D'Onta Foreman's going to see a lot of the early down work for Chicago. But if Roschon Johnson goes, I think that he's easily the top play in that backfield. Sell George Kittle. This is what we get with George Kittle. We get these monster games like we saw in week 5. He caught 3 of 4 targets for 67 yards and 3 touchdowns. But we also see a lot of down games from him. On the season, he has a 17% target share. That's not bad. That's just not elite. And oftentimes across fantasy football, a lot of people look at George Kittle as being a very good fantasy tight end. But get this, Brock Purdy took over the 49ers in week 13 last year. Including the playoffs, Purdy's thrown 20 or more passes in 13 games. So we have 13 games of Brock Purdy. In those 13 games, George Kittle has more than 30 receiving yards in 4 of them. That includes week 5. This San Francisco offense is clearly great. It's way better than I thought it would be. But the up and down nature of Kittle's production is super frustrating. It's great from a best ball perspective because you're going to have that backup tight end fill in when George Kittle doesn't have great production. But from a season-long perspective, it's going to be frustrating. He's going to have these weeks. This is not the last time that George Kittle will finish as a top 3 tight end in weekly scoring. It's just that he's also going to have some valleys. He's not a bad fantasy asset to have. Having that ceiling is obviously valuable. But if you're not up for it, if you can't handle it and manage that, then it's time to sell him. Add Amari DiMercato. James Conner hurt his knee against the Bengals in week 5. That led to rookie Amari DiMercato carrying the ball 10 times for 45 yards and a touchdown. He was the only non-James Conner running back to touch the ball against Cincinnati. And that's because Keontae Ingram missed that game with a neck injury. Now, DiMercato wasn't invited to the NFL Combine. He also wasn't drafted. He's not in my prospect model's database as a result. These types of players who weren't at the Combine, who weren't drafted, they usually don't have long-term fantasy value. But as a random redraft fill-in, sure. If James Conner's out and if Keontae Ingram's out, DiMercato can be effective. He can be an RB2. My only question with this, though, is that if James Conner's out and Keontae Ingram comes back, what does his backfield look like? And my answer to that question is probably a running back by committee. I think Keontae Ingram would probably be the 1B and DiMercato being the 1A, but it could be ugly and a not great offense. Hold Isiah Pacheco. So Isiah Pacheco has now scored a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. His PPR output has been 15.8 points, 24.8 points, and 13.4 points. And during this time frame, he's seen a 7% target share per game rate. So you might be thinking, isn't he a clear sell? He's been touchdown dependent, that's going to regress, and he's not seeing a lot of looks through the air out of the backfield. He's also not playing a ton of snaps. I mean, he's playing more than we probably projected at the start of the season, but he's not seeing an elite snap share. He's not seeing an RB1 snap share. I still don't think this is the time to sell, though. Over the next 4 weeks, no team has a better running back schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed than Kansas City. They get the Broncos, Chargers, the Broncos again, and then the Dolphins. Denver's the best matchup for running backs. Miami's the 10th best matchup. LA's the 13th best matchup. Kansas City also has the 3rd best schedule from here on out. Now, without a touchdown, Pacheco's like a low-end RB2 type. The offense is clearly good, though, and the matchups are there, so scoring opportunities should continue. Buy Amari Cooper. So when fantasy managers are making trades, they don't always have bye weeks top of mind. And what I mean by that is, when a player already has had his bye, there's inherent value in that. You don't have to go scrambling for a replacement when that guy has his bye, because it's done. But when you're negotiating a trade and you're talking to another manager, that's not always top of mind. So use that to your advantage. The Browns just finished up their bye week, so Amari Cooper's ready to go. He has a 23% target share in this offense. That's solid. And over his next 4 games, he gets the 49ers, the Colts, the Seahawks, and the Cardinals. Each of those matchups are favorable when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. The last 3 matchups, the Colts, Seahawks, and Cardinals, those are all top 10 matchups for wide receivers. So the schedule looks great. If you need W's right away, Amari Cooper makes a lot of sense. Now, I will say, I would probably hold on trading for Cooper if we don't get better news about Deshaun Watson's shoulder. So wait for that. But there are plenty of reasons to want Cooper on your roster right now. Add Josh Downs. So this is yet another repeat transaction. I've talked about Downs on the show before too. But he should be rostered in far more than 9% of Yahoo leagues. He now has a 20.6% target share on the season, and in 2 of his last 3, he's hit a 25% target share. Now, Anthony Richardson getting hurt, that sucks. That's a huge bummer. But there's still a chance that it ends up being okay for the Colts pass catchers, whether you're talking about Josh Downs or Michael Pittman. A less mobile quarterback under center in Gardner Minshew would mean fewer quarterback rushes and a higher chance for pass attempts. Now, that's not a lock. I'm just saying there's a chance. Because according to Fantasy Life, the Colts passing attack had their lowest dropbacks over expected rate of the season on Sunday. So don't just assume that there's going to be more passing volume. I think there's a chance that there is, and I'm saying that don't downgrade these pass catchers because of the move at quarterback. But don't also go too far in the other direction. The focus here, though, is the workload. Downs was a good prospect. My model really liked him. He should be able to maintain this 20-ish% target share from here on out. That's roster worthy. Add Chuba Hubbard. Miles Sanders has had a rough couple of weeks. Now, he has been dealing with a groin injury, but who knows if that's playing a huge role or not. We don't know for sure. All we know is that statistically, and when you watch him, he has not looked good. Sanders has now failed to reach a 10% target share in each of his last 2 games. His low from weeks 1 to 3 was a 15.8% target share. Meanwhile, he's gone from an 81% running back rush share during his first 3 games to a 46% one over his last 2. And that's resulted in Chuba Hubbard getting more work. Now, is this the Miles Sanders injury? Maybe. It really might be. But Sanders just generally has not been that good. Within this exact same offense, Hubbard has been significantly better in expected points added per rush. According to Next Gen Stats, Hubbard has a 49% success rate. Sanders is at 28%. Hubbard's rushing yards over expected per carry, 0.4. Sanders, minus 0.7. Are we entirely sure that right now Miles Sanders is the best running back in this backfield? Like, for sure. Because I think that groin issue aside, there's a chance that Chuba Hubbard continues to grow a bigger role in this offense. Sell Saquon Barkley. This might be a little bit galaxy-brained, but hear me out. Barkley seemed close to returning in week 5, so we should probably expect him in week 6. So let's just work under that assumption. Let's assume that Barkley's back here in week 6. Unfortunately, Barkley's been out with his high ankle sprain. And when he returns, it's not a given that he's going to return to full strength. According to Fantasy Points Dr. Edwin Porras, the last time Saquon suffered this injury, he saw a 10% hit in production. On top of that, looking at higher-end running backs who had high ankle sprains, this is all according to Edwin Porras. But when looking at higher-end running backs who had high ankle sprains, we typically see a 20% to 25% rate of decline. They'll see fewer touches in total in their offense, but they'll see even worse production compared to their pre-injury numbers. Now, this isn't to say that it's a lock that Barkley's going to suffer the same fate, but it's definitely more of a negative than a positive. Now, in addition to that, the Giants have been horrible offensively. They haven't scored an offensive touchdown in 3 of their 5 games this year, and their schedule really might not help them. Thus far, the Giants have actually faced the 4th easiest quarterback schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed. They faced the 5th easiest running back one, and the 6th easiest wide receiver one. Moving forward, their running back schedule is the 24th easiest. And in the fantasy playoffs, they get the Saints, the Eagles, and the Rams. Those are 3 teams that have been very strong against running backs this year. So it may seem odd. This transaction might have come from left field. But if Saquon Barkley is returning, you can use that to your advantage. You can say, hey, look, league mate, Saquon Barkley is going to be back this week. You can plug him into your lineup. But this could still be a sell high moment for him. Add Greg Dulcich. So we're getting closer to Dulcich's return from injured reserve, hopefully. Dulcich was put on IR back after week 1, so he's technically eligible to return this week. We'll see what happens. There hasn't really been that much reporting on it. But he's a great flyer when you consider that Adam Troutman, who's not nearly as good as Greg Dulcich, Adam Troutman has seen top 10 to top 15 route participation since the first week of the season. That's amongst all tight ends in football. And as you guys might remember, my year 2 tight end model really liked Greg Dulcich. This offense needs a spark. That spark might be Greg Dulcich. Add Jeff Wilson, Savon Ahmed, or Chris Brooks. There's a lot going on right now that might be absolutely nothing, but it might be something. Devon Achane suffered a knee injury on Sunday against the Giants, and at this moment, I record the show on Monday so you guys can have it for your commute on Tuesday. At this moment, there's no more information aside from he's being evaluated. Really makes my job easy, doesn't it? If Achane were to miss time, then Raheem Mostert would get a big boost. But don't forget that Jeff Wilson was activated from IR. He might not be ready to go this weekend, but he at least makes sense as a speculative ad right now. And it's obviously not a bad one given the offense that we're talking about. But then there's also Savon Ahmed. He might get a boost. But then there's Chris Brooks, who played ahead of Ahmed this past week because Brooks has special teams ability. So basically, all three of these running backs should be on your radar right now. And hopefully it means nothing. Hopefully on Tuesday we find out that Devon Achane is absolutely fine. But the Dolphins get Carolina this week, and that's a very, very good matchup for whoever this RB2 is. This is just one of those situations where you've got to monitor it. Buy Tyler Lockett. So you know all that stuff that I talked about with Amari Cooper and buying players who already had their buy? Tyler Lockett fits that too. He's gotten off to a pretty slow start this year. He scored fewer than 10 PPR points in 3 of his 4 games. He's ranked higher than wide receiver 42 in weekly scoring just once. But there is some optimism. Lockett has a 22.3% target share this year. That's almost identical to last year's 22.7% per game number. His average up to target is 12.4. Last year was 11.4. His catch rate this year, though, is a little bit worse. It's 63% versus 72% last year. So he's not catching as many targets so far. More importantly, he's not doing as much with his catches. He has a 9.2 yards per reception average. That's far lower than his career average of 13.2. And it's easily the lowest that he's had since entering the NFL. Even when you adjust for age, this should not be the expectation. A 9.2 yards per reception rate for Tyler Lockett is not the expectation. So there should be some nice regression coming for Lockett. And then on top of that, Seattle pass catchers have a pretty decent schedule. Only 5 other teams face an easier wide receiver schedule from here on out when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I'm expecting this production for Tyler Lockett to get better. Add KJ Osborne. So another situation up in the air is Justin Jefferson. I have no idea at the time of this recording how long he's going to be out or what the injury even is, at least specifically. If Justin Jefferson misses some time, though, then KJ Osborne would likely see an increase in target share. He's already playing starter snaps. Once again this past week, he ran more routes than Jordan Addison. But without Jefferson's 25%, 30% target share, there's more volume upside in this offense. KJ Osborne would see an uptick in target share. And Minnesota gets Chicago this week. They've had one of the weakest defenses in all of football to start the year. And they're a plus matchup for wideouts and adjusted fantasy points allowed. Add Logan Thomas. I'm not going to lie. I was so angry that I forgot to talk about Logan Thomas on the Sleeper Show this week. And you might be sitting there saying, man, that's quite a hindsight take. But here's the problem. On my other show, Living the Stream, we talked about Logan Thomas being a streamer. It was just a complete oversight, and I apologize. I should have talked about Logan Thomas on that show. But let's talk about him on this show. Thomas has hit a 22% target share in 2 of 4 games this year. And he's coming off a game where for the Commanders, only Terry McLaurin ran more routes. Now, I don't think Logan Thomas's production is going to be that good week in and week out because he did face the Bears. But it's good to know what's possible. And not only that, he gets another good matchup this week. The Commanders get the Falcons. The Falcons are the second best matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So that makes Logan Thomas a great streaming choice once again. This time, I'll bring it up on the Sleeper Show. Add the Atlanta Falcons defense. Streaming defenses this week is actually kind of tough. But according to FanDuel Sportsbook, the Falcons are 2.5-point home favorites against the Commanders. Washington has allowed a top 8 fantasy performance to an opposing defense in 3 of 5 games this year. And they've given up the 3rd highest pressure rate in the entire league. The problem is that the Atlanta defense ranks dead last in pressure rate themselves. So they should be able to generate a little bit more pressure this week, but it's not like this is some ideal matchup or ideal situation. If you don't go the Falcons route, you could also go with the Raiders. Now that's also a very tough defense to play, but they're facing New England, and that Patriots offense has been horrible to start the year. So at the moment, I'm looking at Atlanta and Vegas. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.